Hello, everyone. Sam Eckmann here of Gold Derby, and I am with Kevin Kiner from Ahsoka, the incredible Star Wars composer. And this is not obviously your first foray into Star Wars because you're really the first person to ever put music with Ahsoka Tano from the Clone Wars. I'm wondering, as we jump into live action here, what was kind of your greatest tool in bringing these characters from animation to the world of live action?
Well, first of all, you are correct, and it's a great honor to have my themes be part of the canon of Star Wars. When I started, I didn't even know what the canon was. Somebody told me that, and I'm like, oh, what does that mean? But when I found out, it's just, I mean, if somebody told me when I was 25 years old, getting into this, that someday my themes would be really a part of the DNA of Star Wars, I would have not believed it. The Ahsoka Tano theme was the first thing I wrote for George Lucas and Dave Filoni, maybe in 2006 or 7, something like that. And I remember where I was when I wrote it. I remember what the scene was. She was such a tiny little girl in her, it's funny because because I've been doing interviews, I actually went back and looked at that scene, and it's just wow, back in those years, so many years ago, I forgot what a little girl she was.
Mhm.
And I think that kind of informs what happens with her musically, because this is a person. I mean, I'm writing to be latched on to the character. So, I'm all of my music is in support of the picture, and in support of the emotion, and in support of the journey that these characters go on. And her journey is a pretty harsh one, because all she has known her entire life is fighting and war and battles, and she's been trained by Anakin. She now she knows that Anakin, her master, has become Darth Vader, and this is a great insecurity that she has, that if she is the Padawan to Darth Vader, then is she going to become him? Just and that's, I think, in her mind all the time. So the theme that I initially wrote was, I wrote it using a shakuhachi, which is a Japanese instrument. Funny enough, Dave Filoni really got us into more and more Japanese influenced soundtracks. So the real divergence of her theme starts in Tales of the Jedi, and it's the birth of Ahsoka in Tales of the Jedi, and myself and Dina and Sean, who I co-write with, who are my children, they mostly came up with this kind of samurai groove that we play at the end credits of uh, Tales of the Jedi
Mhm.
Part 1. And if you go back and listen to it, it's much faster than what winds up on the Ahsoka end credits in the live action, and it's not nearly as dark, but it's the evolution of that samurai vibe, because Dave was really leaning into it, just as George was very in leaning into the into Kurosawa, into Japanese, and that's why we have lightsabers. That's why Darth Vader's costume, looks is based on a samurai costume. So um, in the evolution to live action, Rosario gives such gravity to Ahsoka and such maturity, and and so we had to reflect that, in the use of her theme. One of the things I think that made it easier for that was the theme that I wrote, by its nature, was a very simple melody, and not elongated that much. Um, Not really probably something John Williams ever would have written, you know. Uh, and so I was able to morph that, and as well as Sean and Dina, when they were using it, into a darker, into a more elongated, um, and mature version of what I had originally written for a little girl who was sitting alone in her bunk, you know,
Mm,
on a spaceship.
yeah. You mentioned your kids, Sean and Dina, because this is a family affair for you. What does
It
that
is.
add to the process of getting to go on this journey with your kids?
Well, just personally, it is everything. Ahsoka would not, the live action Ahsoka would not sound the way it does. I would have never, first of all, come up with that samurai vibe. Now, even though I was getting the direction from Dave Filoni, you know, my kids, they grew up with anime. And so it's much more in their DNA than it is in mine. My DNA is Jerry Goldsmith, John Williams, Ennio Morricone, James Horner, you know, that kind of thing. And even in the classics like Aaron Copland and that kind of thing, Stravinsky. So I never would have come up with that vibe, that dun 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 dun
Mm,
dun 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 kind of groove that is our samurai Ahsoka groove. Also, I've been doing this for 41 years, and I've been working on Star Wars, like I said, since 2006. So, you know, emotionally, it would be pretty easy to burn out, um, and that's where it means everything to have my kids working with me because they take the load off. You know, when you're a composer, you're sitting alone in your room, and we get some really horrible deadlines sometimes, and we have to be really creative and really good in a very short amount of time. And that, you know, when I start off a show, I'm looking at a mountain I have to climb. And after 40 some years, that can get on you, you know, emotionally and creatively. And that's when burnout can happen. So by them taking the load off of me, I'm not faced with that mountain anymore. And it's a magical for me in my process, just a magical thing not to be looking at this dang thing like, oh, I have to finish 22 minutes by Friday or I die, you know, and everything's over with. Because if I mean I do have a certain amount of work that I have to do by Friday, but I know that I have that pressure valve. If I don't finish, or if I'm having trouble, I can lean on them, and they encourage that, and they're great at it. So, and it's funny, once that pressure's off, then you just blast,
mm.
you know, because you're not worrying. It's not part of the baggage you're carrying with you anymore. So that's mostly what it is. It's a very personal thing.
Yeah, and I would imagine, something that might help, combat burnout is that so much of this work feels like a very new direction for the
Yeah.
Star Wars universe. And like I'm specifically thinking of there's like an original song, I think Igyaka, if I'm pronouncing that
Yeah.
correctly, that Sabine listens to as she's driving around. And I don't think I've ever heard, a recorded rock track. We've had Cantina music for sure,
Yeah.
but what was the impetus behind that style of music?
Well, first of all, that came from Dave, and he had a rock track. He thought she should be listening to something really rebellious, you know, motorcycle rock of some sort. And there was a really iconic piece of music in there that, you know, wouldn't have ever worked in Star Wars. And so we started thinking, okay, how can we really show the rebellious side of her? And I think, you know, that really helped. With Dina was on the road with a group called the Illuminati Hotties, and Sarah, who wound up singing Igiyaka, was the lead singer for that group. And I mean, it was for real road trip, on a bus through all of the United States. Uh, it was probably, she's not ever going to do that again, Dina. But it's great, when you're young, you can do that and be on the road in a van with a bunch of people. And so anyhow, I think those kind of punk indie roots were really useful to us, and Dina really took the lead in that. Dina also majored in songwriting at the Berklee School of Music, so she was really into writing tunes. Also, we wound up collaborating with Ludwig Göransson on that, and he kind of brought a new way of producing it, and he's so good with records and with tunes and stuff like that. And I think it really brought it to the next level when Ludwig got involved.
Yeah. I also really appreciate, just thinking of new things in this series is the music you've written for the villain characters. There's those like dark tones for Balin and Skull, and then of course when Grand Admiral Thrawn is introduced, there's that really distorted, creepy, maybe it's an organ, I think,
Yeah,
or horns.
yeah.
I have to think when you're scoring a Star Wars villain, it must be so hard to get away from like Imperial March. So how do you break away from that?
Well, maybe it was difficult a couple, 15 years ago. I've been on such a journey for so long. Even my kids have been on, Sean's been working with me for 10 or 11 years. Dina's been working with me for 8 years. And we've been working on Star Wars. We worked on Rebels together, we worked on season 7 of the Clone Wars, and I've worked on Clone Wars, so I've had like Darth Maul and, all these great bad guys. Because, John didn't really write a theme for Darth Maul. There was just a few whispers or whatever, and that's about it. So I got to flesh that out, which was, again, a great honor and really exciting. I think the thing that you really touched on is I'm always trying to move forward stylistically. So if I look at my career, if I'm to be just really frank, I'm not like a Danny Elfman or even a John Williams or an Ennio Morricone, where you can really just say, "Oh wow, that's Kevin Kiner." There are some things that you can, but I've kind of been a chameleon, because I scored like Narcos Mexico, and I scored CSI Miami, which is very electronic. I did Peacemaker, which is really rocked out, and I did City on a Hill with Kevin Bacon, where it was extremely soloistic. And that's helped my burnout as well. But it's also, so to me, my strength is my range, and I love that about my job. That I'm sort of like a shark. Maybe this is a stupid statement. But I have to keep moving or I can't breathe. And I'm a very ocean-centric person too. So my analogies are baseball and the ocean usually are all my metaphors. But yeah, I musically I always want to be moving forward, and I push my kids that way too. So we're always exploring something new, and one of the most kind of trite things that you can hear from a producer, like when you first start a gig, is like, or from a studio, is like, hey, we want something that we've never heard before, which is, that's really easy to say, and everybody wants something groundbreaking, and but we really strive for that, and we bang on different things, like the flute Dina uses in Ahsoka is a cheap $8 flute that I found, is a tourist flute from Hawaii. Only works for a few notes, but for those few notes that it works for, it has some really interesting overtones. So we really try to push and be experimental, and also co-writing in my life has really helped that. Working with guys like David Arnold, on like I did the Bond video games and Wing Commander and or working with Gustavo Santaolalla on a number of different projects. You know, these guys all have different processes that I didn't really, they weren't in, they weren't part of my vocabulary until I started co-writing with those guys. So that's been really useful too.
Yeah, it's interesting, you going through your resume because you have worked in many different genres, and yet this Star Wars has been so ever present, obviously, for so many years.
Right.
What is it about this big landscape of music? You get to work with great orchestras. What is it that does allow you to, as you say, keep moving and incorporate new elements every time you come in?
Well, I think, it all starts from the head, which is so George Lucas to Dave Filoni. And, you talk about wanting to not repeat yourself. George Lucas originally, I was reading this book, originally there was part of the script of A New Hope was in Japanese with subtitles. Because he got so into the Kurosawa, and then, he would go to his cabin and do writing sessions with his buddies like De Palma and Scorsese and I think Spielberg or whoever, and they would say, well, maybe, and they would pull him back from that. But the point was, he wanted to do something that had never been done before, and he kept, and when he hired me, he would ask me, to put hip hop in the show and stuff, and we had to find out that didn't work together, but the exercise was illuminating because it was the exercise in pushing things, throwing things up against the wall. Maybe they don't work, but give it a try. Dave Filoni has the same DNA, and really he's our driving force in the last 14 years. And he will come up with things, and he has these kind of ideas. If you ask specifically, your question was, what is it about Star Wars that allows us? I've given that a lot of thought, and I don't know exactly. I believe, like, one of the things when I interviewed with George Lucas, because it was a audition process. So, but when I first met with George, and they had decided to hire me, and he was talking about being big and bold and whatever, I said to him, I've never been accused of being subtle, and I think that is part of my DNA, and if you hear something and think about the Imperial March. I mean, dun 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 dun. That's not subtle, man. I mean, John went for it and he swung for the fences. Think about Jaws. There's an interview where John talks about, when he first played the Jaws theme for Steven Spielberg, Spielberg thought it was a joke. He goes, dun, 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 dun. And Spielberg goes, ha, that's funny. And he's like, no, really, this is what I'm doing, man. And so I think Star Wars lends itself to really bold music. And so whether that's electronic, whether it's an interpretation of Japanese samurai music, which we did in Ahsoka, whatever, if you really swing for the fences, you're going to hit a home run in Star Wars because it allows you to. This is not Twin Peaks. It's very different. I hope that's not too old of a reference. I can't think of a newer one.
No, we got you. Well, you certainly swung for the fences here with Ahsoka. So wonderful job, Kevin, this season. We can't wait to see where it all goes next. And if you're watching out there, make sure you stick with Gold Derby the rest of this season. Kevin, thanks so much.
Okay, thank you. Great to be here.